也出现了多少日我理解人大家先都没得不都跟弄到现在这不我一当过着人没写的完了会完了会的
소수시팔라 숨 룩는데다
사자와 루디 룽에 대다 타되지 제자면 봐 들어와 룽에 타되지 제자면 봐 룽에 타되지 제자면 봐니 치다 잠새 남라 추 파지 취재 줘봤다 파지 취재 줘봤다 디시지부 남라 추 파지 lum바 줘봐 예 어디게 다 룽아 봐 탄되지 제자면 봐들 가데 로도비 유유미치르지 로함 참모이나 로도비 유유미치 지된 치료비 쳐라 주나 지된 뭐 치료비 쳐라 주나 추이장 안에 치료비 쳐라 안에 누바데 릭소 제나 다 미리데 가서래 지다 참지 남라 최파제 대제당 기타 점세 남라 최파제 안에 대주 제바 대주당 저 가서 제시당 저시당 아니 교창소 파지 취재 줘봐 따를 자세 교창소 연구지 치주 최와 세체와 연구 치주 아니 치주 아니 치주 최와 세체와 타바더바나지 제자 마인바 줘봐 따를 타바더바나지 제자 마인바 줘봐 치주 줘봐 세체와 타바더바나지 제자 마인바 줘봐 따를 디시도 지부바 남라양 디시 지부 남라 저 파지lum바 줘봐 인 세들아 저 파지 짜바와당 리라명아 담바당 담바서데 lum바 줘봐 인베 된다와 되다 타바더바 남지 나바 탐제도 바와 쳐봐 인어
So next it shows why one should not engage in the practice of those evil or bad systems if one wishes liberation, and that's given in verse 295. Someone might say, if ordinary people engage in outsiders' tirtaka practices, the outsiders' practices, because they may be perceived by coarse forms of awareness, there's something that we can understand. It says here actually that there's something we can understand. Why shouldn't it is right for one to do so as well? And the reply to that is no, it's not right. And the verse here says, Brahmin practices are said mainly to be outward show. That's one way to translate that, or as hypocrisy is another way to translate this. They're primarily hypocrisy. The practices of the Nirgranthas are said to be mainly, for the most part, stultifying, or one could translate that as stupefying as well. Stupefying. Since most Brahmin practices, such as recitation, fire offerings, burnt offerings, the incantation of auspicious verses, the practice of repentance, confession, and so forth, are mainly hypocrisy, outward show, for the sake of reward and respect. It is said that they should not be performed by those who seek liberation. Similarly, it is said that most of the Nirgranthas practices, such as allowing their hair to become matted and utilizing the, she says, the 5 fires, is that in here? Yeah. Employing the 5 fires are stupefying, meaning they make one stupefy one. Therefore, those who seek liberation should avoid them completely.
Oh, yeah. 다들 가서를 아무 멤버 그거 집이 순이 잠시 르발랑발라 잠시 그거 잡았다. 지다 르발랑발라 잠시 그거 잡았다. 지단이 뭐랑 티신이 뭐랑 와라 지부 와라 자와 주루 잠set 남기 아니 취주제 와라 자做인배 아무마바 카지 니 리제 담바서 리바 칼람발라 지다 리제 담바서 네 리바 칼람발라 참서 그와 깨워 참선은 뭐 아는 그와 깨웠다 티시도 니라지세와 니라지세와 동아시 니몬베 꾸지 람발라 아니 지부와 귀시 자와 주로서
And the next point is that the way in which these are, how these give rise to respect to people with inferior sort of faculties. And this is given in verse 296, where it says, Brahmins are revered because they adopt the orthodox. I'm not sure if that's right, but anyway, that's the way it's translated. Brahmins are revered because they adopt the orthodox. Their granthas are pitied because they adopt the deluded. Brahmin practices are mainly for outward show. Thus, some unintelligent people revere Brahmins because they adopt orthodox practices, the practices of those lineages, such as reciting the Vedas and so forth. They revere and pity the Nirgranthas because the Nirgranthas adopt painful and deluded forms of behavior, such as mortifying the body through sun and wind.
Oh, yeah. 다 되네 가서 루테다 답이 최림비 균전이세 답이 최림비 균전이 최림바레베
러레 줄 lokpa이나
최림비 균전이세 동아 레기 남미실 지다 최수 뭐줘봐 기시겨와 레기니 남미인지 최마인이세 나 리가도 땜바기 리스와라 소와 안에 소와 동아 미게 왜라지 남이 임비실 아니 지다냐위 동아 진도 최소 무조와 티신도 최소 무조와 티신도 동아 내기 남미실 지다 최소 무조와 티신도 잠세 남기 깨내 수이 깨와야 온지 내기 남이 임비실 아니 밀라 소와서 아니 토리 토제 그 처음 말에 세대라 지시 레지께 와야 남이 이제 처음 와이
So next goes showing that these are not, the reasons why these are not systems that one ought to take as being the noble dharma. One should not adopt them as, consider them the noble dharma. And that's given in verse 297. Suffering is a maturation, the ripening of karma, and thus is not virtuous. Similarly, birth too is not virtuous, being a maturation or ripening of actions, maturation of actions. Painful sensations such as mortification of the body are not virtuous, but instead, like the sufferings in the hells, are the maturation of non-virtuous actions, karma. Similarly, because it is a maturation of past actions, as are the eyes and so forth, birth as a Brahman is not something virtuous, enabling one the attainment of liberation.
Oh, yeah. 다 되는 가서 밀어서 토리토지 시험하이노 달래시 뉴데 담발라 레버샤와 뉴데 담발라 뭐당 치료비 덤비처럼 무급이 굉장히 치료와 덤비처럼 무급이 굉장히 다 담봉거니 천이 도나 미세와 디시샤와 남지송 천이 도나 미세와 디시샤와 남지죠 돈이 양한 대와 대니 대니 마시고叫동아 최면의 최가시 인叫동아 최면의 최가시 이세나 아니 가서래 시안에 비싼바다 아니 좀 되게 그냥 라웨게 아니 룡아기 아니시 룡아기 내니 아니 가서 시안에 차와이라 룡아기 니지 차와이라 미세와니 아니 텔라 로바 룡아기 어시안라 차와라 로바기 아니 룡아기 내 아니 거지람고 대나 토리 토지기 체니 너나 미세와라서 아니 지시셔와 남지 초송 세가나 가서래 또나 전에 메제와 디지셔와 남치송 야
Next comes reason in brief, showing in a brief way what is the proper explanation or good explanation of that which is properly expressed. And this has the actual exposition, demonstration of this, and then showing the reason why these outsiders teacher, the dharma of the outsiders teachers is not something that one should respect. And then that's given in verse 298. If birth and suffering are not virtuous, what is? Answer, harmful thoughts towards others, as well as physical and verbal actions thus motivated, constitute violence towards others. Nonviolence is the opposite of this, namely the 10 virtuous paths of action. The 10 types of action which are the avoidance of non-virtue. And then the verse here says, in brief, Tathagatas explain virtue as nonviolence, and then the latter half of the verse will follow, and emptiness as nirvana. Here there are only these two.
전에다 가서 돈이 양한 대화대 din이 마시고 세대라 타바토바 셰비 최니 안에 라신지 주에 돈이 라신지 양대 당하서 거다 라신지 주버 돈이 무슨도 돈이 이시 되기 유 돈반이데 라신지 양대 당是吧 전쟁이 공부 제발라 돈이 무슨 돈이 이시 되기 공부 제배 동아 때문에 기위 아니 최전도 통네 동아 세바 동아 세제 동아 때문에 기위 최고 최전도 통네 아니 동아 세비 세자 루부지 처마단 차와 세자 루부지 처마단 차와 어디 된다고 루부 치자들 양아는 대화대 루부 가서 다들 가서 루부 치자지 고밤 루부 치자지 나대 어디서 치자지 나대를 대화대 니리 미세 왔다 나대 팀이 마시고
So then, therefore, those who, the dharma which enables one to attain high state of rebirth, high status, heaven and as a god, in brief, is non-violence. And that's what has been taught by the Tathagatas. And then, with respect to the dharmas that enable one to attain liberation, this is explained as the emptiness, which is things not being established by means of their own intrinsic nature, and this emptiness is also referred to as natural nirvana, being nirvana by nature, and that when one perceives that directly, then that very object, that natural nirvana, then all suffering, when one sees it in the sense of as a phenomenon in which all suffering is completely unarisen, is totally unarisen. So this is referring again to this natural nirvana, another name for emptiness, things not being established by means of their own intrinsic nature. And that is separated from all of the adventitious defilements, adventitious stains. And that very nirvana, which is separate from all of the adventitious stains, is referred to in the sense of non-violence and nirvana. Those two alone are the teaching of the Buddha.
Oh yeah. Riba tuju wale. Tini tongju nyade la desin chawa me. chawa ya me sete. Ki karere sana tini tongju sete tonlam tomne shesha batar. Tonlam tomne nyande 잠시 토바 샤기 세 톤람 토디 잠바 아니 가서를 라시 nyande 무슨도 토바기 이시데 다 토바 인장 대담라 nyande 가서를 nyande 잠시 토바 샤기 대토바라 nyande 토바라 대잠시 토바라 아니 부모 말려봐 가봐 먹었어 라치다 냐데라 라시 냐데 사제 냐데 라메 냐데 니네 냐데 시시와와 어딘가 부모 말려와 가봐 하면야 대송구지리 먹어서
So then it's given, the explanation of this is, or mention of this is also given in the 60 verses on reasoning, where it says that seeing, when reality is seen, nirvana is attained and the task is accomplished. Here, this says that that this natural nirvana is obtained on the path of seeing, and in that sense, one says that nirvana is attained, but this is not referring here, or doesn't entail the cessation of the aggregates in their entirety. When one attains the path of seeing, one actualizes this natural nirvana, but does not actualize the nirvana in the sense of the complete cessation of all of the aggregates. So here then there are multiple types of nirvana. There's nirvana, natural nirvana, which was just mentioned, nirvana with remainder, nirvana without remainder, and then the non-fixated or non-localizable nirvana, unfixed nirvana. So those four, but here this is in reference to the natural nirvana, which is first realized on the path of seeing.
오야 텐더위 아니 라신연당 모습도 또위 이시티기 아니 동안여와 시버가 이시 타바가 차와 차바 인자 대수회나 대시 차와 차바 인세대 타바 토바랑 여와 돈이 또거와 땜비체도 이노
So then here it says, by seeing reality, nirvana and the work to be done has been achieved. One can read it that way, and there that would be saying that that once one has achieved that path of seeing and gained a gnosis which perceives this natural nirvana through perception directly, then that extinction that's been actualized through that is the initial part of the remainder of the path, which then will culminate in the final completion of the path.
다치로와 덤비처럼 무급이 굉장히 란조직된 탐자라 계사신도 도추나 개인 도바 체비주 철학한 게 도바 주로 시로와 남지 투비 담반디 아니 통신도 양 최니 원디라 무거시나 무거시나 란조 냠발라 차비치 란조 냠발라 차비치 디다 랑기 첼라 차바니 지된 탐자라 통만 매바나 콤베 란조라 차바데 아니 콤베 랑기 제사 유신도 도치 차베 동메데바 큐나 란조 지된 탐자라 제사신도 도큐나 그나스 란조티 아니 노바체비 주 대다비 노바체비 주 대당 주 대당 가바 미시와당 동반이 제샤와 최유부태에서 가바 미시와당 동반이 니제 동반이 제샤와 최유부태 치료와 제라 주칸게 두바 추데 랑게 따왕에 바라 온바 셴바 산 온바 셴베 산제지 쳇데라 미주코
So next shows the subject here in this following verses, the reason why outsiders don't respect the dharma of the teacher, the Lord Buddha, and I think I mistranslated that topic heading previously, but anyway, this is the right. Why do the outsiders? The reason why the outsiders don't have respect for the dharma of the teacher, and that's given in verse 299, where it says, "When outsiders are aware of the sage's Buddhist teaching? Why do they not appreciate these two principles, the ones that were enumerated above? And the answer that is given, because they are attached to their own mistaken positions, their own erroneous, and it says actually evil positions, wrong positions. To ordinary people, their own position, like their birthplace, is attractive. Why would you find attractive that which precludes it? And then the commentary continues. Attachment to their own position is something ordinary people have been accustomed to since beginninglessly. Like their birthplace, they find it attractive and do not want to give it up because of their attachment. Why would you outsiders, here's addressing them, find attractive these two principles which preclude and are contrary to your own position? You do not follow the Buddhist teaching because you cling to your own wrong views.
Oh yeah, that didn't that. Let's say long one time, but repeat when you say like that. London never double long. You must say the meeting la. Could you keep in my name? Ani kebe ani rang jesa ki ani jesa de anu gubam dunga chi ju thone kepa ne ani joba yubi yu shan la tamba tar kanshi khombe ondo da ngele tabi taba tobi reni ondo da ngele 타바 토비 리니 현지 숑래 현지 숑래 런던 레바데바 랑와차시 숑현래장 텐더비 아니 런던 데바게 레바 랑와차디 리비트니 현래장 런던 레바데바 랑세나 베나 이마 초동장 차베 사디는 내비 미델라 나위 차와 쳬베 초론다 때베 사디는 내비 미단 탐제라 나위 차와 쳬베 꾸지 지든데 셔바 미남 임바 티신도 이마 사디 미단라 꾸지 지든 마이남 최딩이 장 냠수 라나 가소래 냠수 라나 탐제라 팬도바 코나 유베 구하단데베 최디 차와 르소.
So the next shows an instruction to take up this good explanation. That's given in verse 300. The intelligent who seek what is good adopt what is worthwhile even from others. Does the sun not belong to all on earth who have sight? Wise people who see their birthplace as a cause of their difficulties, reason for their difficulties, they leave it and settle in a more prosperous place. Likewise, intelligent people seek what is good and therefore adopt those points which facilitate the attainment of a high rebirth or liberation once a familiarity with them has been gained, even though they are from others' texts, the text of others. The sun is unbiased and provides light for all on earth who have sight. Does it not belong equally to all? Similarly, the practice of these two principles can be of benefit to anyone. Thus, it is fitting to practice them with a sense of appreciation.
Oh yeah, that didn't was the Shenji Tani Danchade, Kashi Dobe Tanzin La Chacha, Siji Lamji Muba Tadoba, then you Rashimela Kawacha said it. Takasaya Kondu Shaba Nashi Shijawala, Sunelon and Tony Banyambo Nature Shower Shake, Ani, or Church a bit new. Oh, then you could send you there. I don't know. Damn, chatty. She let you know you send you then the change. Only Cho Kashi, Dobe, Neluji, Cho Kashi, the Neluji, 10 Dobe, Ani, or Kasore, Tanzila, Chabatan Trawa. Dagmi, da, Ani Rashi Chua, Zimbam, Yana Tanzin Tatala Jana, Ani Kasore. Jidem you Tasha to Tawa Tanzin, Rashin Zubalatan Jaya, Kashi Dabel, Kashi Neluji, Kashi Deba, and Tanzila Chabatan Chawa Cheba. Oh, 수지 아니 스바 코와 그 자와 당전 죄벌의 채비 아니 남 가르래서 미바 타두바의 가르래서나 사모 동반이 수지 남지 미바 타두바 대주라신 매라 캐와차 스바 코비 자와 죄죄제 미바 타두바 아니 대주라신 매라 캐와차
Next comes the concluding stanza, and here Gyaltsab says, "Here I say, this make oneself possess the qualifications of a vessel for this good explanation, which by understanding which one becomes free from attachment to the misapprehension of all of the extreme views, grasping at the extreme views, and one should become educated or skilled in the ultimate object of the path which cuts the root of existence, and that is dependent origination as being essenceless, devoid of intrinsic existence or essenceless. So here the good explanation is that which is well explained, is the teaching that's embedded in this text, the teaching of the Buddha. And so one should make oneself come into possession of the characteristics of a vessel for that, as were enumerated above earlier in this chapter. One has to have impartiality, respect for the teaching, and enthusiasm, make effort to understand it. And then once one has that, then one should train oneself, make oneself skilled or educated in this teaching on dependent origination and being essenceless, meaning emptiness and so forth, which is that which, if you understand it, here what one needs to understand is the way things are, reality, and this, if one does understand that, then one becomes freed from attachment to these views which grasp things in extreme ways. For example, the way the Lokayata school believes that only sensible objects exist, and therefore there's nothing beyond this life. And then the other views that were mentioned earlier as well, that grasp at things as being real in various degrees. So once one achieves that, then one needs to train oneself in this ultimate object, here the term objective object to be observed, of the path which cuts off the root of existence. Here, that's the root of existence, as mentioned previously, is misapprehending things as being real, and so one needs to train oneself in that, and that object which serves to cut that off, to eliminate that, is the understanding of dependent origination as essenceless.
Oh yeah, thank you. Very much. Thank you. But then
the chapter title comes.
Oh, that I just Sumba. I just Sumba la. Shiva Ambotan turn. Then do Gaba la. Levi Shusha, the Levi Chan, Tandamba. That Tambola. Turn the Rugaba, Shiroji turn, that's so the Rugaba, Ribajawa Shabata. The Betomba Dumata Sumba Damba. That Tambotella, the Rugabi Ribajawa Shabatella, Sunja Wande, Ambota turn Damba Gabata. Siji Yujan Damba Gaba. And Demi Mudrutavo, Ani Mudrutavo Masaji to Damba. That Tambotella Sunja. Turn the Macaba Telaya, Chilcaba, Soso Caba, Tabo Chilcaba Telaya, when I Ribashi and Damba. Tango Telaya, I say, Danita, I say, we can say you don't talk about Ribadation and Jova, Suran, Suran, Zakwana, Musu, Bacaba, Ruji Suma Damba. Oh, Tambo Pumba Rangatru, Wanshi Jomusun Tomacaba, said that teacher. Pumbaranga Tani draw one young was to talk Gaba. Sudon Tana Pumbani, Tamja Kwana Tom Mitchell. Pumbango Shejava, Tini Riba Sushima. Ribi 20 Shan, London Levy Della Long. shemana lesha de kan shena ase da derwa ngo tam ja rashi lesha kare resana ngo tam ja rashi de ma ba thong wo ngo tam ja rashi ji ma ba to mini de rashi mena da rashi ji mena tame de jugure rashi ji mena ane tame de juba yin da pombi ra la so wa ngo su de tubi 관세 반민배 관세 무슨도 주반 민배스나 봄당 원보라 소야 원도 주의치 봄바다스나 원보라 소와 무슨도 주의치 뭐 탐제 라시 예바 관나 오시나 야 이 가서도 예매도 지 봄바라 소와 무슨도 주의스 들려 가세 둘라 가르쳐도 들어가도 들라
미시
들어가도
규티 마시메나 예메
무슨 주비 판민배 왜
무슨 주
봄당 원보라서 원도 주비 칠
There's a problem in the text here. 마시메 예메 교회 공부를 하다 혼수당에서 나비 문숨도 두번 멤베
무슨도 주반 민배 봄바당 원보라서 원도 주비 칠스래 왜 대만도 삼아서 무슨도 주비 봄바당 원보라서 원도 주비 칠我他们家是也把宽大运动线呐，这个是都，一个的马到没那三的看这呢。
跑上岗这就比超人那里，而且也没这个帮人老师，完全的。完全就。It's impossible to cognize that all phenomena have no inherent existence, for if they did, they would be totally non-existent, like the horns would not be.
No, yeah.
문숨도 주법 맨에 임пата.
무슨도 주법 민배 봄바당 원보라서 원도 주의 칠. 봄비라서 원도 주법 민배 안 봄매스 봄바당 원보라서 원도 주의 칠. 뭐 탐제 라시 예바 관나고.
봄바당 원보라서 문숨도 주배치.
도시 왜?
임пата. 제.
다다 주시야.
However, since the pot and blue are directly perceptible, 봄바당 원보라서 문숨도 주배치.
원도 주의 칠스. 저기 여기 다 여기다 무슨도 주의 주법 민배 봄당 원보세도가 대리다 대 무슨도 주법 민배 봄바당 원보라서 원도 주의시 뭐 탐제 라시니 예바 코나 오시나 템바제 만들었어. 그들아 가르치나 뭐야 다 좋다.
So next chapter, next exposition here, number 13, which is rejection, the way in which one meditates on the rejection of the faculties, referring to like sense faculties as well as cognitive faculties in general, and objects, the rejection of those. So this refutation of, specifically refutation of there being real sense faculties, cognitive faculties, and real objects. That starts, the basic topic is the exposition of the text of the chapter. And then there's at the end, the statement of the title of the chapter. The first of these has two subdivisions: the extensive explanation of the reasoning, which enables one to negate or reject, refute the existence of real objects, and then the subsequent things will come later. So the first one of these has three subdivisions: refutation of the the thing to be apprehended here, the objects to be apprehended, both in terms of the cognitive faculties as well as their objects being real. That again has multiple subdivisions. 2, there's a general refutation of that as the first, and that has 2 subdivisions, the actual general refutation, and then some other reasonings will be adduced. First of these has 5 subdivisions. Here showing that a refutation something like a pot, for example, which supposedly exists by means of its own intrinsic identity, could be seen, directly, visibly perceivable by a sensory cognition, sense cognition, or sensory awareness, and then that, let's see, there's 4 other divisions that'll come as we come along. So the first of these is showing that the something like a pot being established by means of its own intrinsic identity to be visually perceptible by sense faculty or sensory awareness that's not acceptable, and so that's rejected in the first verse here of this chapter, verse 301. So here, the beginning of this is introduced by Ruth. Here has brought back the verse from the end of the verse from the last chapter, where it says, when in stanza 300 it says, the intelligent who seek what is good adopt what is worthwhile even from others. What is this good explanation? Then the reply to that is, it is about seeing that all phenomena have no intrinsic existence. And then the assertion is given here of the opponent. It is impossible to cognize that all phenomena have no intrinsic existence, for if they did, they would be totally non-existent, like the horns of a donkey and so forth, and would not be directly perceptible. However, since a pot and blue are directly perceptible, all functional things are in fact intrinsically existent.
Oh yeah, that didn't can ask. Puma only you to one was to Tom Metabatas. That only you to what I see you to one was to Tom Metabatas. That was to Thomas said, Thomas that Thomas said, Cabaya, was to Thomas said, what I tell you the Mandra, now I don't was to Thomas. Was to Thomas said, I tell you the Mandra, and it. Never that to what you go at it. In that don't about the Toma Kanajana Yang Pumbangoni, you was to Toma Midabata, Ketana, and a Pumbagi Suton with Lotis, Pumbi Suton with Lotiki. Sudon Tana Pumba is, or Tedana Pumbi Suton with Lotiki, and a chatam jeton, Grace, and Oniji, Tona, and a Shankala Ramala Tongore, and a Tetonala, and a Pachicheva Meba. Shala Ramala Tongo in Zang, and it chatam jen Tongo or Kashi. Mishiji Pumbi Suton with Tena. And a Pumbi chatham Jacona Tom, Jewish, Michigan Pumbi Suton Wajana, and a Pumbi Chasha Tamja, and a Michigan Tonga Maris. And it was Mitomi Series. Pumbangosum, Shawayang, we take it about Sushi Mars. Pumbangosum, Shawayang. The country, Pumangoso, Shawayang, we take it about Sushi Ma, say that the Tesungumendo, the Deo. Only you Pumba. I also say Jawade, only tell you, tell Kwana about Sushi Ma.
So then next comes the verse is actually given, and here in the translation it says, when seeing form, here this is referring specifically to visible objects. Form is used in multiple ways in these translations, but sometimes it's the term underlying this, rupa or zuk, refers to physical things in general. Sometimes rupa or zuk is used to refer specifically to the objects of of visual awareness, visible objects, visible forms. And so this is what's referred to in this context here. Visible form, when seeing a visible form, one does not in fact see the whole pot. Who that knows reality would claim that the pot is directly perceptible also. So then the commentary elaborates on this and says, it follows that direct perception of a pot which exists by way of its own character is not feasible. So here, if it were, the awareness perceiving the visible form of the pot should perceive all of its parts. Yet when visual consciousness or visual awareness perceives the pot's form, it does not in fact perceive every single part of the pot. Who that knows the reality of things would claim that the pot is directly perceptible. And the word also refers also to a blue. Here blue refers to a patch of blue, homogeneous percept blue being existing by way of its own intrinsic identity. She translates by way of its own character. I'm translating by way of its own intrinsic identity, which is crucial for what follows later on in this explanation, the difference there. So here the point is, in the text it says is seen, that is when visual awareness sees the visible form of a pot. The word see there can be understood in two ways. In the simplest sense, when the pot is appearing to the visual awareness, that we can say that the visual awareness sees the pot, but just the mere appearance of it. But there's a deeper level of cognition in which the visual awareness ascertains the visible form which is appearing to it, and that is what is at issue here, is being referenced in the case of this specific cognitive event that's under analysis here.
Oh yeah, pomong some xewayang, ngoi tenyi riba sushi ma sa de ta, ngon ji chu ngoi some xie ma do xie ji dang pomong some ra, ngon ju dang, lu tan ju le la ngon ju le xia go de,是吧？de yi ma ani ga se ye ge 我们我说写下王在这个样在的我样个这的样，我不让咱这我不让咱不让咱把写要让咱把样写我他就把这我不让咱把碰碰让我你去碰把些碰把你都在接了。都在接了等呢，大把让个成绩出，都在接了等呢，大把人家都在接了等呢，大把让个成绩出是嘛的是，说他们家呢，同样没容易吃的是，让个成绩出啊当，说他们家呢，同样他们家同样没容易吃的是，说个人，说几同样是吧？说几同样，说他们家同样没容易吃的。提醒都没了说话，让个我也出呢，没让个我也出呢，你皮心了嘛对吧？提大都没，你试过了，皮心也没了嘛对吧？你让个我你就行了，你皮心也没了嘛对吧？你试过吧也是，皮心了嘛又把大都把我的所有人我去了。多个我他阿不说了带呢，咱每个阿不他，那样阿不他，那样阿不他说吧，带呢，我什么写，你没有什么，大家阿不了带呢，你我大家这种就是大把单车吧，他多的话在下个了吧，然后大家阿不出现了，这样出现不了带呢，你大把单车行满足于这帮我什么参与下个了吧，我第一张多个我他。阿不说了，但呢，我什么这种准备大把单车吧，是这种这种准备大把单车为希望让我什么的对吧？你是日把单车把单干有钱的，你路让我什么让我就下马多，我就下马多，真的了，这种的大把单车为我什么的对吧？的日把单高啊，当今天个车把单高啊的，
So then, when we talk about the pot as being perceptible, and the statement here is that who that knows the reality of things would claim that the pot is perceptible. Here, this has to be qualified. She has directly perceptible, but I think that's directly is redundant because perception is direct. It's something that's perception entails the object appearing to the cognition awareness that's cognizing it in an unmediated fashion in general, as a general sense. So here, when one says that a pot, who that knows reality would say that a pot, who knows the reality of things, and here we could say that as like functional things or things in general, who that knows that reality would say that a pot is perceptible. Here we have to qualify that because in this system as well, the prasangika system, we of course would say that things are perceptible. There is perception, cognitions which know things that are perceptible, and the objects themselves are called percepts or perceptible. So those things are establishable, but here this is critiquing the presuppositions of the opponent who holds that for something to be perceptible it necessarily has to exist by means of its own intrinsic identity, and therefore this qualification has to be applied. And then the following line is that the word also says the same thing applies to blue in the sense of a patch of blue existing by means of its own intrinsic identity. So then the text continues saying that the pot is designated in dependence upon the 8 substances that serve as the basis for it, and therefore cannot exist by means of its own intrinsic character, by means of its own intrinsic identity, nor by seeing one part can one see all its parts. So here, the key point there is the intrinsic identity of the thing. If the thing had intrinsic identity, then it would exist without being designated in dependence upon the parts, which are its basis of designation. It would have that kind of intrinsic identity entails a sort of autonomous existence that would preclude the thing being dependent upon designation, upon the basis of designation, which in the case of a pot is the collection of 8 substances that are the material basis for a perception of a pot. Nor by seeing one part can one see all of its parts. Seeing one part of the pot, you can't see all of the entirety of the pot. Similarly, if fire existed by way of its own intrinsic character, then the fallacy that it should always keep burning would arise, since it would not require fuel. So if a fire had existed by means of its own intrinsic character, that intrinsic character or that intrinsic identity would preclude it being dependent upon things such as fuel. It would have a kind of autonomy, being able to perform the functions that it does without burning and producing heat, without being contingent or dependent upon the basis, the things that it depends upon for its production. So that sort of fallacy would also arise.
Oh yeah. 다 가르쳐 가르쳐.
again, 독에 왔다 왕부 소소를 원숨시.
독에 왔다 왕부 소소를 때는 원숨시. 되게 맞소. Yeah.
So then, dialecticians, it says here, this term dialecticians is a way to translate people who engage in what the implication being specious kinds of reasoning, engage in specious, meaning fallacious kinds of dialectics or reasonings. They contradict both reasoning, logic, and common knowledge when they call awareness arising in dependence upon individual sense organs perception, and assert that an awareness free from conceptuality, in which and she goes on to say a sound image and a generic image may apprehend it as merged, is direct perception. She has a note explaining this, but to gloss this another way, that so these dialecticians would say that they identify perception as occurring individually, dependent upon the individual faculties. So the visual faculty is responsible for producing perceptions of visual objects, likewise with the auditory faculty, sounds and so forth. So these perceptions, what they call perception, is held by them to be a direct cognition, which is separate from thought, separate from conceptuality, and which is suitable to serve as a basis for the mixture of what is called the artha samanya, a term universal, or term universal, or an object universal. These are technical terms referring, the first one referring to a term as subsuming all of the particulars that fall under it, universal in that sense. And likewise, the object universal is a conceptual object which functions in the same way, subsuming all of the particulars that would fall under it. So that, so they would say that perception is an awareness which is separate from thought, which mixes together those kinds of universals in its cognition, because thought operates through the medium of these concepts, which are the sort of mental aspects of terms and the objects of conceptualization. So because they hold perception in that way, that's their definition of it, is perception is a cognition which is free from conceptualization, which is direct and unmistaken. Those three criteria are their defining definition of perception, because they, and so that kind of definition and that position contradicts both reasoning, as will be shown later, as well as the sort of general way in which people in the world understand perception to operate.
Oh yeah. Musum de batan trabatan kawi sheres. Shewa keji rewang rewala yang musum de miruma. Shewa keji rewala unju yowa yizang. Ane musum la ane tende kontu shabaki datin de rudu de tobatan trabatan de gogu yena. Ane shewa keji rewala yang unju yowa yizang musum de miruma tawatang. 지대 나양 다와 차와서 교투매 아는 무슨 주유 무슨도 차지 요새나 맞아봐 쳐졌어요 원주라 아는 무슨도 차지 유라 유동원도 주유체 또 왔다라 원주도 차지 아니 요새나 맞아봐 쳐졌어 这些都安排希望我说都开安排，你希望先到把呀慢着把习的，安排希望，这话你这话来希望瞧我噻，
是不是先么多吧？么多我是。So then next, the point being is made here that each individual moment of consciousness cannot be a direct perceiver, is the way she's translated, a perception. In the world, objects like the waxing moon, which are directly perceived by many people, are commonly held to be perceptible, things which we can directly perceive, whereas that which perceives these objects is not called perceptible. So here the distinction is being made, or rather perception is being defined in terms of the object of perception, the percept as such, rather than in terms of the cognition, which is the agent performing the action of the perception. So this is a technical or crucial distinction in differentiating Master Chandrakirti and the other Prasangika's way of understanding perception from that of the Sautrantikas and yogacharas and so forth who hold that perception is strictly, the term perception is limited to the cognition itself, the awareness that knows the object, whereas Chandrakirti is redefining it or defining it in terms of the object as being perceptible rather than the cognition.
Oh yeah. That ribate shanlan chawani. Namba jaban diniji, lojo dembe trishimda, ngadan jamba tamjata, soso gaba chawa yin. Da pumbada ombola sowa, da rangang woni ji chubam, ani rangxin ji chubala, ani wangxin ngusum de deba gobi. 어디다 암비셔와나 무슨도 대바 고비 리바야게 콘데 샤바 테기 아니 대바 고비 리비 넘바 샤바 데니지 넘바 샤바 데니지 로르단 대바 로조단 덴비 케와 나미 메도기 틸라 소바 틸라 티심바다 롱아와다 riba jawa tamje riba rija jamba tamje tang rangung o chuba ani khasore wangxie musum de deba yang soso kaba chade ro di khasore senam wangxie musum go ribi naba jaba de noso de deba kewe mishigi su tongxin drama dongwa tang ani timu dongwa rija me dongwa 그러면 원이 좀 나타 통과가 송기니까 개와 남이 노저도 되면 개와 남이 매도 그 틀라 지심바 남이 매도 그 틀라 지심바탕 오롱아와탕 아니 리자 잠바탕 리자 잠바타 탐자랑은 원이 좋아라 왕신 무슨 되봐야 소소 가바차와 이노
So then this is explained more extensively in Master Chandrakirti's commentary and when explained there, so one can learn more about that from that source. So this is, but it's not, he has not elaborated on it here because of concern that it would be too extensive of an explanation for this context. And Ruth gives some good explanation of this in her notes to this as well. So then the next point is showing that one can apply other reasons to this as well. By means of this very analysis, those with superior intelligence should refute individually all that is fragrant, soft, and sweet. Fragrant, sweet, and soft. By means of this very analysis, using the reasoning which refutes the assertion that sense consciousness is a direct perceiver in relation to a pot, blue, and so forth, being existing by means of their own intrinsic character. The wise, those who have superior intelligence, refute separately in each case the contention that sense consciousnesses are direct perceivers in relation to fragrances, such as the fragrance of jasmine flowers, sweet tastes, and that which is soft to the touch, all existing by means of their own intrinsic character. She has own intrinsic, by means of their own intrinsic character. So here then a flower, like a jasmine flower, let's say, it has a sweet, it's beautiful, it has a sweet taste, a smell that it comes off of it, and then it's soft to the touch. So it has all of these properties, but only individual sense awarenesses or sense consciousnesses are able to perceive those various qualities of the single thing, whereas if they existed by means of their own intrinsic identity, that is, all of those characteristics and the base for them, the specific thing, possessed those characteristics by means of its own intrinsic identity, then it would be the case that all of those sensible properties would be perceived by all of the sense faculties, sense awarenesses, without requiring the individuation of them, the separation of them into specific faculties and awarenesses.
Oh yeah. But oh, the what trouble la, chaji tone, chashi ma don wa dang, start to hold the shaba na xin. Ani, the what trouble je de change la, ani sunzi mishiki su ton la, ani drama don wa dang. Dan the mishiki, ani zajin la su mi don wa dang. Ani wang xie teda gi yu chen zimba dang, ma zhe ba zimba gi, ani keba ya me go wa. 아니 유라 니랭게 차바양 차바소 아니 샤도 미루베 니와 차다 탐제 아니 가서 덴바 주바 대바 대달라 니와 차다 아니 탐제 주구레스
So then, now here we accept that our sense faculties and sense awareness cognizes the specific aspects or properties of things, the sensible properties of them. That is, this smells, sounds, taste, touch, visual forms of things. Each of the specific sensory awareness knows the specific aspect of a thing. A sensible property of a thing, so as to, that is, vision knows the form, the color and shape of things, visible forms of things, hearing hears the sounds of things, and so forth, through all of the five senses. So we accept that there is that kind of cognition, but we would say if things existed by means of their own intrinsic character or their own intrinsic identity, if things were established, if things were real, that is, they existed by means of the intrinsic nature that appears falsely to us, then when we would see a single part of a thing, we would necessarily have to see all of the other parts simultaneously, because they would all be, one part would intrinsically have all of the other features of the other part as well, intrinsic within it. There would be no way to differentiate them. And then the same thing would occur in terms of whether or not we come in contact with a specific object through our senses, we would nevertheless have to be able to perceive it because of the intrinsic character of that thing, or intrinsic nature, identity of the thing. It would entail that the sensory cognition of it would occur regardless of whether or not the sense faculty is encountering the sensible object that is the perceptible object that's specific to it. And then likewise in terms of distance, if things existed intrinsically in the way that we falsely conceive them to exist, then whether they're nearby or far away, they would all be equally perceptible, and all of those sorts of distinctions that necessarily occur in the establishment of perception would not be something that we could posit, and therefore all of these faults that had been enumerated would apply.
Oh yeah, that is la. Su ran zan tong wei xian tong wa jiao ba, ha zhang ta wa ni, 是吧？苏让咱同学先同我叫把哈上他话你是，看的苏同话一天，他们在同话就那里，马同话为苏同话，同话明白几米钟这个了，但我嘛多点话了说话给，俺碰把苏嘞，在太太把面包碰把当碰比苏牛在这个是。 在这应当碰把当碰比苏尼，有的人是看了得的，住在这因为碰着没些个碰把通话那，俺那太当住在这个有参加通话的，他果然是开两个的。啊，看见我通话有原来当他通话也是，我是，俺那有了住在酒吧，往些有了住在酒吧开两把一张。 那的中国人吧的，是吧？你说碰别书来，再太太把没比起书同学碰比恰恰他们叫同学举了些那什么，看的没些个碰比书同学也，看的书同学也太是没些个书同学也碰比恰他们叫同学举那话举那你是。 那这样搞起来讲那么多，你搞起来讲呢，是吧？恰他们叫举话，举那你没些个碰比是 미시기 분비 치마도와 마도와의 수통한 대바양 통한 멤버치 미주르세 또 오마기 분비 치다 아니 분비 수용이 어디 아니 가서래 통성을 말해 권이 유디란지 갈래도 주의사지 말아 아무 소소 유용해와래 야 이제当我你去出那钱你这么多的话所有通于分别差他们叫通完就话就那你米些就分别起码多话米些所有通完得把样通完明白几米就是几米就是确实通完他们叫通完讲呢아니 차지 마동 와야 마동得把样아니通完像米的少
So then next showing that by seeing a intrinsically identifiable form, or a form that exists by means of its own intrinsic identity, visible, we're talking visible forms here, by seeing those that one would necessarily have to say that one sees all aspects of it, one would see everything at the same time, and that's of course an absurd consequence that goes way beyond what is warranted. So this is given in verse 303, where it says, here says, all parts, someone might say, all parts of the pot are seen when its visual form is seen, for the pot is not a separate entity from its visual form. And then the reply to that, here we have to apply the object of negation, that qualification. Here the irrational or the unacceptable consequences obtain if the form, visible form, or the object, the base for it, the pot, existed by means of its own intrinsic identity, by means of its own intrinsic nature. If that was the case, then all of the absurd consequences that are enumerated in this discussion would obtain. And so the answer here is that if because the form is seen, everything is seen, why because of what is not seen would the form not be unseen? So if on the grounds that visual consciousness sees the pot's form, one can posit that all parts of the pot are seen. Why on the grounds that visual consciousness does not perceive the pot's smell would even the visible form, which is accepted as seen, not be unseen? If one posits that all parts are seen because one part is seen, even that which is accepted as seen cannot be posited as seen if one part is not perceived. So there it's saying that the pot, for example, has multiple sensible properties, the visual form of it, the visible form of it, and then it might have a smell too. So if these things existed by means of their own intrinsic identity, then all of the different, and if you claim that when I see the visible form of the pot, I see the pot as such, and if the pot exists by means of its own intrinsic identity, then one would necessarily have to be able to perceive all of the other sensible properties of the pot, its smell, and so forth.
Oh yeah, that then so ranzan ana ko ranzan ba khona la ngu su yin ba ka ba ni ta mi shi su ji mi shi ta wo ana so ranzan ba khona la ngu su yin ba ka ba ta de yin ji ra so ranzan ngu su yin ba ka ba ni su ni ba shi khona la ngu su ji ni ya ba yin ya ma yin kan shi de la pa ro ji 차다 주로 유예치를 이제다 분방 모습이下降没涨 분비 수용 모습이 출라스 분바시 가대 분비 수용 모습이下降没涨 분바 수용 모습이 출라 균에 분방 원이지 주방 모습도 주보서 대균에 분바랑 거 원이지 주방양 모습도 주보세나是吧 다 분비 수용이랑 거 원이지 주방 마치 코나라 무슨 일이 여봐 말해 뭐 주발라 아니 무슨 일이 여봐 많이 받다 관계 시제 관계 채나 아니 간수님 바시 권하나 무슨 일이 여마 이 균장 관계 채나 수요되라 파로지 차당 수로지 차당 아니 유지차 두마 예배 아니 차투마 두어라 때나 따바지래 차투마네 두어라 때나 따바 임비시래 강라 오숨도 주위 오니지 주와 중세장 매도 차 두만을 따바 연자 인장 아랑전지 마주바레스 마주바 인장 강라 오숨도 주위 랑경 오이 주바 중세장 요 말레스
So then next comes showing that that one is rejecting the idea of the form being existing by means of its own intrinsic identity, that such a form could not be, rejecting the idea that it could be perceptible here. And that's given in verse 304. The 304, the opponent here might say, though the pot is not a directly perceptible object of comprehension, its visible form is established by perception, and thus indirectly the pot existing by way of its own intrinsic nature, by means of its own intrinsic character, is also directly perceptible. And then the reply to that is, there is no direct perception of just the visible form alone, because it has a close and distant part as well as a central part. So it follows that there's no perception of just the visible form alone existing by means of its own intrinsic identity, and by means of its own intrinsic character, because the visible form too has many parts, such as close, distant, and central parts. There's a near side of it, there's the far side of it, there's the middle of it. And thus it is designated in dependence upon its many parts. So here then, the point is that the thing is, the visible form itself is designated in dependence upon all of the various parts that make up the near, the far, the middle, and it exists only that way, so therefore it doesn't exist by means of its own intrinsic character. There's not the slightest thing existent by way of its own character that is perceptible to any kind of awareness.
야, 너네 이거는 가르쳐래. 다 주제당 총바 땜바 되라. 아니, 누라 차샤 유메지 잡아태양 주바 주리. 대진 루바를 차와이 아니 주제 주바 미대소. 안 차단 대다 차단 차샤 차와나 수디 아니 두 차럽지 아니 타두바 내라. 아니 누라 차샤 유다 메지 잡아나 두태양 안에 주벌 주대스 대라 둔접지 차연나 두대라 둔접지 차연나 통발라 소와 신 차투만에 따와 임배 안에 두대 안에 두차라 임바 양바레스 두대 둔접지 차연나 통발라 소와 신 아니 두대 두차라 가서 차차 투만에 따와 임배 안에 두차라 임바 양바레스 아니 누데라 차샤 메나 아니 손도 매바 주로 차차면 아니 손도 매바 주로 개실 오랑자 마주바 주바 차와이 아니 누자 본바랑고 오인지 좋아니 무슨 지자자 좋아 무슨 지자자 좋아데 미래도 스타가잘 말이야.
So then next comes showing the same thing as similar with respect to that which here one can talk about this in terms of the that which is responsible for creating something, producing it, and that which is produced out of that process of production. And so here the analysis goes down to the level of the atomic level. For example, a pot is composed of particles, and then the opponent here is maybe falling back on the idea that there are partless particles again of matter. This also applies when one examines whether the particles have parts or not. Thus, to prove a thesis by that which must be proved is not feasible. Or one could translate this, Sapje again, the title here is showing that the evidence or the proof, the reasoning supporting is similar to that which is to be proved if one reads it like that. When all of the parts are separated, the form is finally reduced to the smallest particles. An investigation of whether particles have parts or not applies to those particles also. If they have parts like a front and a back, they are like the pot, designated in dependence upon many parts, in which case they are no longer the smallest particles, or in the text here it says the notion of irreducible particles, the finest or smallest particles of matter, is not maintainable, not viable. If they do not have parts, they cannot exist because of being inapprehensible. And this applies then again to the idea of things existing by means of their own intrinsic character. If the particles of matter don't exist by means of their own, if they supposedly exist by means of their own intrinsic character, then if they're inapprehensible and not cognizable, then they couldn't exist. Thus, it is not feasible to prove that the pot exists by way of its own character, intrinsic character, as a perceptible object of knowledge, of comprehension, by means of that which must be proved, for things do not exist by way of their own intrinsic, by way of their own intrinsic nature. They're not established. Here it says they're not established as things which could be validly known by perception, if they existed by means of their own intrinsic nature.
Oh yeah, that riba shen dan ba de la. Oh, riba shen dan ba de la. Gun jiang yang la du chu na, lan yang yang la jian du chu. 提起一个绝巴样，第一把没有喏是，他先啊，俺那安不书见就有，安不书见没有，俺那书说，书说到我是吧？书记姐姐到我，安不书见就有，安不书见就送我吃有，俺那书记姐姐到我给团了大把拿。 贵讲，俺那眼了见了对呢，眼了见了对呢，俺那切些的让眼了都脚当，那样俺那让给切眼了见了的，让那个眼了了对呢，俺那让眼了见都脚的，对呢，眼了对了眼了见当，眼了见了对呢，眼了都脚提起日。 俺呢，对住他们把提起来，让给切下来，但那大把咱们都杀了，提起让给切下来，但那大把咱们都杀了。都拆了加把切把提醒是，都拆了加把台把提醒是，他的呢，那样样了见到求入是，提起一个加把样式的，老说都拆了加把切把提醒，明个他的那边一个阿拉呀，说了加把样。 俺那天拿起，对着就过来下巴银白，几天去他家怎么都，俺那让跟我你就把没有弄，并且点呢，其他那个等中个去他们家，俺那名咱们大咱们都，俺那大把咱们都，俺那喜欢吃过的是，
So then there's next comes some other reasonings that are adduced, and this is in verse 306. Everything too is a component as well as being a composite. Thus, even a spoken syllable does not have existence here. It does not exist within this, you could say in this system too, in the sense of existing by means of its own intrinsic identity or character. Moreover, when objects apprehended by the physical sense organs are examined, all are components in relation to their composites as well as composites in relation to their components, and therefore are merely designated in dependence upon their parts. As with the analysis of the smallest particles, we could say the smallest bits of things, names which are ultimately reducible or ultimately reduced to spoken syllables such as the first letter of the Sanskrit alphabet, are also just conventions in this world. They're mere conventions in this world, and do not exist by means of their own character. Thus you must recognize that all dependent originations, all phenomena which are dependently originated, are mere names and mere, she has mere terms, or one can translate that as mere signs as well. Mere names or mere signs.
Oh yeah, that didn't take you cover the sun song. That's also cover the you rang on your trouble, ambition by Gabata. It is in Bagaba. Annie, you rang on it. Tambo, you rang to ambition by Gabatella young. Tab, ye said, the new Gabata, yet the new Gaba. Tambo tell that the new Gaba, ye said, Tambo, you Gabatella, Rande Gaba, the Center Gaba. 난들 가봐대라 카도 입기 뒤수란데 진짜 가봐다 중앙 이위 주지 순 내가 가봐 염려바 때봐 있나 다 담보 카도다 입기 뒤 수란데 미시지 순된 쳐봐 제 당신 찍단 판다라 따나 가봐 세세임바라.
So next comes a specific refutation of this in detailed refutation of various positions held by those who hold that things are established by means of their own intrinsic nature. And so that is multiple subdivisions. First, the refutation of an object existing by means of its own intrinsic character as being something that's apprehendable by the senses, by the sense faculties. And the outline goes on in much great detail, but eventually we arrive at the first main subheading here, which is showing that the idea that first of all we examine two things here, like a visible form. A visible form is comprised of color and shape, and if that existed by means of its own intrinsic identity, and then assume that the visible form, which is comprised of color and shape, exists by means of its own intrinsic identity, could that function as something that would be apprehendable by visual awareness, visual consciousness? So first we examine those two things as to whether or not they have their nature is identical or different, and that comes in verse 307.
Oh yeah, that is啦。哦，看得多了，有些呢，在这看到他一句对比碰比，那实际接下来一旦看到你有别那呢，一旦看到过对比碰比数，让咱没写起汤圆，按那平方公式都出不现呐。但看到的一年让心现人几个人是吧钱，是吧？让现那么几个人，看到来。人多了，所谓一让心嫌疑呢，是看到来，人多了，所谓个一让心疑呢，你其他部一点没写记兄弟的钱呢，真把没叫他，没写个没兄弟的钱呢，真把没叫他，没叫他看到了在线一不起，原的在线明白让心去准备记忆呢。一看到的一步的，让自己准备经验呢，那记得着；让自己准备呢，用个经验呢，那了解民工明白民工那都了解，那人多了说为因为真把大人，那民工来说看到干不到嘛不了说话给看到讲，那真把没就我的真把就过来的，再做的看着人把身上第一他在没去第一经验不起来是，
So next comes the verse which explains this, examining whether or not the visible form and is single or diverse in character and nature, and then so the opponent here might assert, the pot is directly perceptible since visual consciousness sees the pot's visible form existing by way of its own intrinsic character, by way of its intrinsic. It exists by means of its own intrinsic identity, consisting of color and shape. And so the answer to that is, if shape is distinct from color, how is shape apprehended? If it is not distinct, why would the body not also apprehend color? Are color and shape inherently one or distinct? So the analysis here is saying if these things have, if their character, if their basic nature is intrinsic, then these faults would obtain if one examines them as being identical or distinct. If shape such as length and so forth is inherently distinct from color, how can a visual consciousness take shape as its object of apprehension? It follows that it cannot, because shape has a character or is distinct from color. It's intrinsically different from color. Alternatively, if they are not distinct, different, but inherently one, why does touch not apprehend color in the dark, just as it apprehends shape? And it follows that it should, because they are one. If they are intrinsically one, they would not differ in character in any way whatsoever, and thus the means by which we apprehend one thing would, the color and so forth, would also make us be able to apprehend the shape of it even when we're not seeing it. We'll stop there for now.
记住心。